Welcome everyone to an introduction to Autism BrainNet, understanding the importance of brain donation for research. My name is Kathy Fiskus, and I am the operations coordinator for PMSF. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers with us today. Carolyn Comich-Hare serves as Autism BrainNet's clinical director. In this role, Carolyn works directly with donor families to facilitate the donation process and conduct essential clinical interviews. Alicia Halliday is the Chief Science Officer for the Autism Science Foundation, and she's also the current chair of the board of PMSF. In her role at ASF and PMSF, she works closely with the Autism BrainNet to help the community understand the importance of brain tissue research. Thank you.
Thank you guys for organizing this session, and thank you to those of you who could be on today.
Absolutely. Kathy, thank you so much for having us. I'd like to extend my thanks also to Ronnie and Alicia for the invitation to join you. And I think that we'll jump right in. As Kathy mentioned, I'm the clinical director for Autism BrainNet, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to present alongside Alicia about our program to you today. So the basic outline is to share with you a little bit about Autism BrainNet as an organization, to discuss the importance of brain tissue donation for research into understanding autism and related neurodevelopmental disorders or conditions like Phelan-McDermid syndrome. We'll talk a little bit about the technical aspects of the donation process, including who is eligible to become a donor to our program, the process as it runs from beginning to end, and a little bit about what it looks like for families who have chosen for their person to become a donor through their participation in our donor family aftercare program. And so to get us going, Autism BrainNet was actually launched in 2014 in response to real interest in the study of postmortem brain tissue and the need to build a collection of postmortem tissue that was substantial enough to support the interest in research and provided the quality of tissue required to conduct this research. And so we started and have continued with sites across the country. We have three primary locations here in the States at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. We have another site in UC Davis at Sacramento, UT Southwestern down in Dallas, and we have two international repositories, one at the Douglas Bell Canada Brain Bank in Montreal, as well as one in Oxford at the UK. And we also support what is called the Autism Pseloidin Library at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. That is an autism tissue program legacy collection that is housed and managed by Dr. Patrick Hoff at Mount Sinai. So our central team that exists primarily to support all of the efforts of the teams at each of those sites that I just described to you consists of our directors, co-directors, including our scientific director, Dr. David Amaral, who's based in Sacramento at the UC Davis Mind Institute. Dr. Marta Benedetti is our managing director at the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative. And you have our clinical team here, which is, of course, myself and my colleague Nicole, as well as our amazing outreach team, Lily Mancisi, and our administrators, David Layden and Gaina. And so many folks ask, how has Autism BrainNet, I guess, done over the course of years since we launched in 2014. And at this point, we have collected more than 300 donations from folks who have a rare, so 34 of whom have a rare genetic condition, including Phelan-McDermid syndrome, without a diagnosis of autism. Many more folks of whom have a rare genetic condition and a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or simply a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. That's 127, as well as about 100, well, 121, it looks like, control donors. And this is where I want to turn it over to Alicia to share a little bit more about the importance of Autism BrainNet and donation for research. So Alicia, I'll hand it to you.
Yes, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind continuing to advance, that would be helpful. That way we don't have to switch. So you guys know the brain. I was watching the patient-focused drug development meeting yesterday and thinking about all the concerns that families have and what impacts the lives of families with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And the developmental concerns were really up there. And that's the organ that controls those developmental concerns is in fact the brain. And we don't know enough about the complexity of the brain, which is why we need to study the brains of people with autism, both without Phelan-McDermid and with Phelan-McDermid. And the only way we can really do this, we know we can get things like size and shape, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We can get things like how big it is, how small it is, what types of cells in a vague way, but we really can't get to how those cells are connecting or what helps connect those cells, or even how those cells in the brain connect to other body parts like the gastrointestinal system, some of the motor neurons, which I know are motor issues are a huge problem in families. So really to get to the specificity, we need brain tissue so that we can not just understand the differences or what's going on, but also develop specific potential treatment targets, right? So like what's going on at the level of that interaction between the brain and the gut system, or what's going on at the interaction between two different regions of the brain. For that, we need brain tissue. And, you know, because of, you know, for a lot of different reasons, for reasons relating to awareness about autism or just the number of people affected. If you go to a brain bank that looks at things like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, I mean, the amount of research that they've been able to do, because people are very willing to donate their brains after they die. And frankly, the course looks a little bit different, obviously, than someone with, say, Phelan-McDermid syndrome or autism. But they've been able to, you would be amazed at what they've been able to find. They've been able to literally map out the course of Alzheimer's disease from the time the first symptoms are seen to when the full-blown syndrome or the full-blown, the maximal disability occurs. And they've been able to see, at what point in time are different brain regions affected. And that's really led to focused potential therapies for things like Alzheimer's disease and even Parkinson's disease, which sometimes the motor symptoms come first and then the cognitive symptoms come second. So what also people don't realize is that it's part of most organ donor registries. So if you're a heart donor or a liver donor or a lung donor or a cornea donor, you can also be a brain donor. So next. And what are scientists learning? So I talked a little bit about why it's important. So we know that at least in autism, and we'll talk a little bit more about Phelan-McDermid, some of the cells in the brain are bigger and some of them are smaller. There are fewer cells in some region and more cells in other regions. And actually, because of brain tissue research, they've been able to link things like the cellular anatomy and even the gene activity. There's a new study that came out that literally linked gene activity across brain regions with sensory challenges in people with autism. So these are the things that we can now target in targeted therapeutics, not just for the understanding, which is important, but then the therapeutics. We know that there are gene environment interactions in every disorder. And one of the things that comes up with the study of families with Dup15q syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder, just like Phelan-McDermid, is that individuals with Dup15q are sensitive to environmental influences for disease progression, just like any other. You would think it was all the Do15Q. It's not. There are environmental influences that are important. And then also understanding what's unique about people with Phelan-McDermid syndrome with autism and without autism, and what's going on in the brain that makes those common. So everyone with Phelan-McDermid shares a common signature, so it could help all features of Phelan-McDermid syndrome, or maybe it's unique to some of the developmental and autistic features. So again, these are things that can only be done with brain tissue. Next slide. And so I want to tell you a little story. It's a nice little story about how the evolution of our understanding of a specific brain region has been influenced through the understanding of studying brain tissue. So a lot of you maybe have experienced this, but 8% of typically developing children experience anxiety in some form, but 69% of children with autism spectrum disorder experience anxiety. And I don't know what the numbers are specifically for Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but I would bet that they were way up there, especially if autism is part of the picture. So people have been trying to think like, okay, where does anxiety live in the brain? Does it live in one place? How are those messages about anxiety sent? Is it specific to social anxiety, or is it more generalized anxiety? And through many different studies conducted by BrainNet researchers at UC Davis and elsewhere, they've tied it to a particular area of the brain called the amygdala. And you can see it, that pink dot, it's about the size of an almond, I've been told. I haven't actually mapped it out, but I can tell it's about the size of an almond, and that's kind of where it is in the brain. And this is where some of the original studies looked at fear. So how does the amygdala react if you're afraid of snakes, like I am, like when a snake is put in front of you, or if you're in a fearful situation, what happens to the amygdala? And it turns out it's lit up. So what happens in people with autism? And you can see that the blue line, now this is the brain, this is the size of the amygdala. So this isn't the cells, and we'll get to the cells, but this is the size. You can see that typically it grows, this is an area of the brain that continues to grow even after you are born into your 20s. We talk about how the brain growth is early on in life, while the amygdala continues to develop and grow and establish connections throughout your life. In autism, you could see at the beginning, when you're younger, it's much bigger than people who are neurotypically developing. But then as you cross into your teens, that growth slows, and in the end, it becomes smaller. So if you look at kids, they have a bigger amygdala. You look at adults, they have a smaller amygdala. So what's going on here? One of the things is, have they just reached a plateau, or has there been something that happens to the amygdala early on, like there's just too much activity? So one of the things that the BrainNet did is said, all right, we need to look at the cells of the amygdala. And a couple of years ago, there was a very large study that looked at individuals, it was 4 years ago, I think it's 2 years, that looked at the amygdala from individuals who had donated brain tissue, if they died when they were younger, or if they died and donated when they were older. And they looked at the different trajectories and compared it to individuals without autism. And Carolyn's going to show you that slide. And it looks very, very similar in many ways to what you saw in terms of size. So as you get older, those number of cells continues. You still see growing number of cells. And of course, there's variability. You can see those triangles and circles are the individual people in the study, and no two people are alike. But you can see patterns in that in typical development, you get more and more cells. But in autism, you start out with more cells, and then those cells continue to decrease over time, much like you see in the size of the amygdala. So this not only explains it, but it also suggests that something's going on in early development, like before kids are 10 years of age, where their amygdala is just really big, has a lot of neurons, and then presumably something's going on throughout development to cull those neurons back, to say, okay, we have too many, we're gonna reduce the number so we get back to where we should, but then it goes too far. And what's also interesting is in people with autism, the age at which you see this intersection is sometimes the age at which you start to see really overt symptoms of anxiety. And nobody's really been able to say, okay, well, it's the social environment that's too that has too much control. So like when kids get to be teenagers, their social abilities, if you have autism, may completely, the environment of all the things that go on when you're a teenager, the social environment just may completely exceed, and the person with autism may end up just developing complete anxiety. But it turns out it's probably both. There's probably a biological reason as well as a environmental reason about why teenagers seem to be more prone to anxiety. But it also tells you that maybe this is the area, these amygdala cells, if we can figure out what to do about these amygdala cells, we can probably do a better job at treating anxiety, not just in individuals who are older, but even individuals that are younger, and prevent anxiety from happening, or as severe anxiety, because I can't presume that no anxiety will ever happen, but to manage anxiety later on in life. So that's the amygdala story, and how how brain tissue really kind of figured out a question in science that's relevant for families. And so, whether it's the amygdala, or there's a new study that came out recently that talks about sensory issues. Why do people with autism have so many sensory issues? And it turns out, a lot of the changes in the way genes are expressed in different areas of the brain can contribute to that. So do we need to think about therapeutics that target those particular processes? And I'm not saying what those therapeutics look like. I'm not that smart or sophisticated, but at least we have some biological evidence. So I'll turn it back over to Carolyn now.
Alicia, thank you so much. I am incredibly grateful to have your scientific expertise in explaining the findings, to date. And toward the end, actually, I have a question for you about the future of research and what direction you see that going. But in the interim, I wanted to, in addition to thanking Alicia, explain that, it is really our mission as a program to continue to build a collection of postmortem tissue to support this type of important research that Alicia just shared with you. And so we're really grateful to the Simons Foundation for supporting this research and helping to establish criteria for folks who can contribute. And so this is a question that we get often, who can become a donor, who can contribute to this type of research? And so the short answer is that anyone with a diagnosis of a rare genetic condition or a diagnosis of autism can contribute to Autism BrainNet's postmortem collection. And when I say rare genetic condition, it's not any just any rare genetic condition, but one that has been included on the SPARC gene list that we know is associated with neurodevelopmental conditions. If you do not have a rare genetic condition on the SPARC gene list or a diagnosis of autism, you can still be a donor to our program. And I think this is something that is often overlooked, which is the importance of having what we call control donors. So donors who allow us to conduct that comparative research. And so if you are up to age 50 years old and you have no known serious neurologic or psychiatric condition, you are able to become a donor to Autism BrainNet. There's one exception to the neurologic conditions. If there is a case of suspected SUDEP without any other neurologic or psychiatric condition, that would also qualify you as a donor to Autism BrainNet. Now, how do people learn about Autism BrainNet and our inclusion and exclusion criteria and the donation process? Well, it's through folks like really important groups, actually, like the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, who have joined us in helping to educate the community at large about the potential to be a donor and about the importance of postmortem brain tissue research. So here's a list of some of our partnering family research and advocacy groups. as well as various organ procurement organizations and tissue banks. We do also partner with the medical legal community in the case that they encounter a family who may have lost someone that meet our inclusion criteria. They'll advocate for our program and introduce us to a family to let them know about the opportunity for donation. So what happens when a family calls our program? They've made the decision to donate, and they reach out via the very important 877-333-0999 helpline. And I state that number and also want to point out that that helpline is a number that you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when you call, you let them know, our answering service know, that you're calling regarding a death that has occurred or is imminent and regarding donation. That key language will clue our answering service to connect you directly with our clinical team, which, as you saw earlier, really consists of myself and my counterpart, Nicole. And we'll work with you, the family, to understand what's happened and to begin coordinating sort of the logistics of the donation process itself. Once the logistics have been coordinated, we make sure that the donation is transported to one of the sites that we discussed earlier. And then you'll expect to hear from Nicole or myself in the coming days, weeks, or months, whatever works best for the family, so that we can provide any support that the family might want or need, but importantly, to conduct follow-up so we can learn all about your person and share that information without the identifying information, but share that information with researchers. And then lastly, for our families that choose to participate, we also offer a donor aftercare program. And this is a way of our continuing to provide support for our donor families, but certainly to keep families who are interested in staying engaged, who value the importance of postmortem brain donation, to help advocate for other families who might be interested in learning more. All right, the donor family aftercare program, just to elaborate a little bit, it's just incredibly important that we provide our families with ongoing support, and so we do that through writing letters, through provision of tokens of remembrance. We do also want families to stay connected with the research that is ongoing and occurring as a result of their very important decision to become a donor to our program. We have also on our website a Memories of Hope page, which if you have opportunity to take a look at, which is at our website, www.autismbrainet.org. The Memories of Hope page is full of just incredibly lovely and moving tributes to our community of donors and their families. We do send out a card to our families every year just to let them know that we're thinking about them and to re-invite their reaching out to us, and of course we stay in touch as folks would like. And so really this is sort of the end of our formal presentation, and we wanted to share with you just some quotes from families that we've worked with in years past. I think that as difficult and emotional a decision as this can be, it has proven for the families that I've had the privilege of working with to provide a real source of hope and just affirmation that their person's legacy is going to continue. And so we leave you with a couple of quotes. And with that, I hope that you have many questions that Alicia and I can answer for you. Here's our number, and a little bit of a reminder about the donor aftercare program. We do have, sorry, I'm going to back out finish this before we get to the questions. I apologize. So we do have, and this is important, resources for families that are interested in learning or sharing information about donation, their long-term care planning intentions. We have all kinds of resources on our website, and you can also access those resources by emailing us at info@autismbrainnet.org. And the last 2 points here are important in that there is no cost to families for choosing to become a donor to our program. And also the idea of brain donation, or the act of becoming a brain donor, does not interfere at all with funeral plans or any funeral plans that you might like to make. Okay. So really this time we'll have some questions.
Yeah, so we did get a couple of questions in. The first question is, can a family sign up for donation before their loved one's death is imminent? So maybe you can talk about signing, like what's the role of registration for the BrainNet? Because I know I think people get confused because of the organ donor card and the driver's license. So what do you do when you sign up? And then also, is there a pre-registration?
Yeah, so I think, so this is a good question, and I hope that I address all aspects of this question. And so feel free to please add some follow-up as needed. But it's very important for families, I think, to distinguish or understand that brain donation is a distinctly separate process from organ donation. And unlike organ donation, where you can register in advance, it is, as Alicia mentioned, part of your driver's license. Brain donation is something that happens is a decision that's made, and the paperwork is completed at the time of death. And so while we invite folks to register for information from our program, a quarterly newsletter, a card that you can share with family members, that is a non-binding commitment to donation. It is very important, even if you sign up for our newsletter, even if you carry our brain donor card in your wallet, to make sure that your family know to call that 877-333-0999 number at the time of death or when death is imminent, so that we can begin the official process for donation.
And then, so I have a follow-up. So when you sign up, what is that? What does that mean?
So when you sign up, you're really signing up for more information about our program. And what happens when you sign up is that your email address is added to a list, and you will receive our quarterly newsletter. And that newsletter is offered program updates, scientific updates, but that is what you are signing up for. It's more information. You are not at that time committed or consenting to donation. You are consenting for more information about our program.
Thank you. It's a good point. We have another question. So how long does the donation process take? And I would assume that it starts at the time that you get the call to the end of the actual donation.
Yeah, so this is, I think, an important question, and I'd actually like to address it from 2 different angles. One is that the donation has to occur as quickly as possible after a person's passing. Ideally, we have people call our number when death is imminent or within 24 hours of death. And that 24-hour sort of marker is very important because, as we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, Autism BrainNet's mission is to provide good quality and enough postmortem brain tissue to support research. As you can imagine, as time passes, so if days have passed after death has occurred, the quality of the tissue changes. And so it is very important to call within 24 hours. Now, from the time of that phone call through the end of the donation process varies ever so slightly, but it will not take any more than another 24 hours for the donation process to be completed. And so most families find that they're able to continue with their planning as they would anyway. So they're able to reach out to a funeral home, have their person transported to the funeral home in the time frame that they normally would anyway, and proceed with any services that they may want to have, including a viewing or cremation if that's what they're choosing. But donation does not interfere with any funeral plans.
And is there, someone asked a follow-up question. Is there a limit after the time for a donation? So you said optimally it's 24 hours. Is there a time at which that donation can no longer take place?
Yes, so we aim to have a donation completed well within a maximum of 60 hours after a death has occurred. And so, you know, I want a family to call us regardless, you know, of 24 or 48 hours have passed, so that we can do our best to accommodate anyone who is interested in becoming a brain donor to our program. But 60 hours is sort of the end point at which a donation is viable to conduct the very important research that we endeavor to support.
Thank you. How does authorization work? So, you know, obviously you're going to need to talk to the family and get their permission throughout this process. How does that work?
Yeah,
do people have to be in person? How does that work?
That's a great question, and we have the means to be flexible in how we conduct the authorization. Alicia, I appreciate that you point out the authorization does have to be done with the family, with the legal next of kin of the decedent. And so although it is a very sensitive time, we recognize that it could feel cumbersome to have to participate in an authorization process at that point, but we do our very best to minimize the burden on our families. So we can do a verbal authorization that's recorded in the moment over the phone. If a family would prefer us to fax or email a copy of the consent so that we can review it together and make sure that everyone's questions are answered prior to signing, we can do that as well. We will do whatever it takes to make this process as minimally involved for the families as we can.
And how does it work when you coordinate with organ donation? So if you're in the hospital, or if it's, relatively soon after a death has occurred, someone will come in and talk to the family about different donation options. I mentioned cornea, heart is definitely one, sometimes liver, lungs. How would that work with brain donation? Do families have to make a separate call, or can they tell the coordinator, or how does that work?
That is such a good question. And so you have both options, actually. You are able to fill in the person, the representative from the organ procurement organization with whom you're talking, to let them know that brain donation is a priority for you. And that you intend to work with Autism BrainNet for that to happen. They can contact us and we will work with them to see the donation process through. It is the case that we will always have to have that conversation directly with the family. So the family could also choose at that time to reach out to us directly so that we can both complete the authorization process and collect the information for the organ donation organization. And we will, again, work with them to make the donation, all of the families, we want to fulfill all of the families' wishes, and we'll gladly work with any organ procurement organization to do that.
I also see Kate still is on. I'm not gonna make her join, but Kate and the foundation have led the way in trying to understand what some of the causes and circumstances around the deaths of people with PMS have been, because sometimes they can be clear and sometimes they're not so clear. So can you explain what information you gather during the clinical visit that can help this, help not just the foundation, but scientists understand some of the factors that contribute to an early death in people with PMS?
Yeah, so it is the case with every single one of our donors that we want to conduct as thorough a natural history as possible. And so we do that through conversation with the family, where we're learning all about each person's behavioral and physical development, from birth on. In addition to that, we are collecting medical records, genetic reports. In addition to that, we also, for every single one of our donors, will become part of a cohort that a small tissue sample is sent to the New York Genome Center, where comprehensive whole genome sequencing is done. And so all of that information is then de-identified and available to researchers. And I think that the feedback that we get, which of course we welcome additional feedback if there's something more that we can add to the information that we're collecting. But as it stands, the feedback that we're getting is that we have such a comprehensive clinical profile of each one of our donors, that the researchers are really, they value that information. It's sort of unique to our program to be able to access that type of comprehensive sort of clinical battery.
And it's really important for the research, right? Because no two people are alike, and you want to make sure that you learn as much about that as possible. One of the things along those lines, one of the things I know that a lot of families are concerned about, which they should be concerned about, is this issue of neuropsychiatric regression. So this happens mostly in girls, but not entirely in girls. And around puberty, but not always around puberty, sometimes later, just talking about averages, when there seems to be a regression really in psychiatric symptoms. So girls or boys or whoever will become catatonic, sometimes manic, sometimes hyperaggressive, sometimes they'll lose verbal ability, become sometimes it's linked to depression. It's a host of neuropsychiatric symptoms. Is this something that ABN can look at or has the potential to better understand?
So I think it's a good question, and I would rely on your scientific expertise to speak to this from looking at postmortem tissue. But what I can tell you is that we have the clinical biobehavioral profile to associate with the research findings. Absolutely. This idea of neuropsychiatric regression alongside catatonic states of, also weeks, sometimes days, sometimes months of catatonia is something that we capture and are happy to make available to researchers.
So I would say the answer is yes, but I think, it might be too early given the number of donations to make any promises about PMS specifically. I think that we probably need to have some further data, but this is something that's on the mind of a lot of families. So I thought it would throw it out, and I think that we need to understand what's going on in time genetics, so you can look at the genetic profiles across different brain regions, and definitely around regions involved with things like emotion, including the amygdala, emotional regulation, interactions with different brain systems that control that. And we've also talked a lot, especially with Candid, which is the GI initiative, around what goes on in families with rare genetic disorders in terms of why the connections between their brain and their gastrointestinal systems is not working right. So it seems like the worse the GI symptoms, the worse the behavioral symptoms, and that language and verbal ability plays into this. And this is another question that I think could be answered, maybe not just at the brain level overall, but specifically with those neurons that connect with the GI system. And I know that's definitely on the horizon. So I wanted to throw that out there as well, because I know that that's something that families really, especially a lot of them that experience severe gastrointestinal problems, are asking about.
Are interested in. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more question that we got was, what if I know of a family that might be eligible, but I don't want to ask? I don't want to be the one to bring it up. What should I do?
That's a tough position to be in, and I think that one of the recommendations I would make is to do your very best in the short term and as soon as possible to normalize this conversation around the idea of donation. There was a time when even the idea of organ donation in general was challenging and somewhat taboo. And I think that if we can make an effort to associate the idea of planning to become a brain donor with all of your other long-term care planning considerations, that will really help you in the moment when you want to have that difficult conversation. If you find yourself there and are not able to pursue the conversation yourself, I would really encourage you to reach out to the leadership, to Ronnie, to Kathy, to Alicia at the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, and let them know that you have this. You have some awareness of a situation and that donation may be an option for that family. And I know that they would gladly support you in having that conversation.
Are you able to share how many brains have been obviously nobody's names, but just how many brains have been donated from individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, either with or without autism?
Yeah, so to date, we have six donors with Phelan-McDermid syndrome. And I think you were alluding to this a little bit earlier in looking at sort of even, the regression, neuropsychiatric regression, catatonia, where we're certainly interested in learning more about each individual donor. Over time, it's going to be very important to have more donors so that we can look at what are the true similarities and differences, just on a larger scale, so that we can generate some more reliable research.
So normalizing the conversation and not being afraid to discuss it is probably the number one reason why people should sign up for the newsletter, right? Because you get these scientific updates and information about the program in a very normal way, like you would get updates from your child's school about what's going on scientifically, and you can better understand why this program is so important. So that's a reason to sign up for the newsletter as well, is just to make it a normal conversation and make it the way that you would have for any planning of death. And I know that it's very, very scary for parents to think about not just their child's death, which is horrific, but their own, right? Because we're the caretakers. What's going to happen? And we tend to avoid the topic, really. But this is, talking about it isn't going to make it happen any faster. So it's something that we can do pretty easily, is to at least look at the newsletter or sign up for more information.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a great point, Alicia.
Don't see any more questions. If people want to ask a final question, we have a couple more minutes. Otherwise, we'll give people back a couple more minutes out of their day today. Thank you guys for all joining. Thank you, Carolyn, for such an interesting, every time I listen to a presentation, I learn something new about the program. So this was really interesting and really provocative. And I hope that this means that families want to talk about this more. You know, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, but you certainly get to learn about the science if you talk about it more. So thank you guys for all listening and being a part of this. And Carolyn, thank you for being on today.
I appreciate you having me.